I was sitting in a paper gown on an exam table when my phone buzzed against my thigh through the thin fabric. I almost didn't check it. The nurse had just left to get the doctor, and I had maybe 90 seconds of privacy before someone walked back in and asked me to explain again why my blood pressure kept spiking at routine visits. I checked it anyway. It was my mother, dropped you from the family plan. Your sister's treatments come first this year. I read it twice, the way you read something that doesn't fit the sentence structure of your life. Then my father's name appeared underneath hers. You're healthy, she actually needs it. Then my sister. You'll understand when you have kids one day. I sat there in that thin paper gown, with my feet not quite reaching the little metal step, and I felt something in my chest go very quiet, the way a room goes quiet right before a storm hits a coastline. Not loud, not dramatic, just still, in a way that meant something underneath it had already decided what was going to happen next. I typed back 2 words, your choice. Then I put the phone face down on my knee and waited for the doctor, because whatever this was going to become, it wasn't going to become anything in a gynecology office with my blood pressure cuff still printing out numbers. My name is Megan Holloway. I'm 32 years old, and until that Tuesday morning, I thought I understood exactly how my family worked. I was wrong about almost everything that year, but I was never wrong about what came next. And to explain what my mother's text actually meant, I have to explain the diner. My parents have owned Holloway's on Route 9 since before I was born, a 22-booth diner with a pie case by the register and a laminated menu that hasn't changed except for prices in over a decade. My sister Danielle works the front some mornings when she isn't at her real job in medical billing. My father runs the grill. My mother runs everything else, which is to say she runs my father, the schedule, the register, and increasingly the version of events our family agrees to believe about itself. I don't work there. I haven't worked there in 8 years. I'm a physical therapist at an outpatient orthopedic clinic 40 minutes away, and I built that career on purpose, slowly, without much help from anyone at that diner. But 6 years ago, when the diner's health insurance broker told my parents their small group plan was about to get dropped because they'd fallen under the minimum number of enrolled employees, my mother called me in a panic. She needed one more body on payroll, on paper, to keep the group plan alive for herself, my father, and Danielle. I was already covered through my own employer at the time, technically, but my plan had a $6,000 deductible, and theirs didn't, so I let my mother put me on the diner's books as a part-time administrative employee. 4 hours a week, technically. I answered the phone for reservations on weekends I wasn't even at, which nobody ever checked, and my name went on to payroll as an actual employee, which is the only reason the insurance broker could legally write the diner a small group policy at all. Group plans need a minimum headcount of enrolled employees to qualify. Without me, the diner had 3 enrolled people. 3 wasn't enough. 4 was. Nobody explained this to me as anything other than a favor. Nobody explained it to me as a structural requirement either, not really, not in language I understood until much later. My mother said, "We just need you on the books, honey, it's paperwork," and I said okay, because that's what you say when your mother asks you for something that sounds small. For 6 years I paid my portion of the premium every month, a modest amount that came out of a paycheck I technically received from the diner and then immediately signed back over because I never actually worked those hours. It was a formality wrapped around a formality. I used the coverage exactly twice, once for a sprained wrist and once for a physical I could have gotten through my actual job's plan if I'd bothered to switch back. Meanwhile, my parents used it for my father's blood pressure medication, my mother's knee replacement, and every single one of Danielle's basic health needs for 6 years running. I never minded. That's the part I want to be honest about, because this isn't a story about a woman who resented paying into her family's insurance for 6 years and finally snapped. I didn't resent it. I liked being useful in a way that didn't require me to actually work the diner floor, which I'd hated as a teenager and never wanted to do again. It felt like a fair trade. My name, my 4 fictional hours a week, in exchange for keeping my parents' healthcare intact and knowing I was the quiet reason it worked. There's a particular kind of role you fall into in a family without anyone assigning it to you out loud. In mine, I was the one who understood paperwork. My mother handled the diner's day-to-day, my father handled the grill and the walk-in cooler and almost nothing else, and Danielle handled being the daughter who needed things, which she did well, in the way some people are simply better at asking than others. I handled the parts nobody else wanted to sit down and read line by line: tax forms, lease renewals, the insurance policy itself, which I'd read cover to cover the year it was rewritten, mostly out of boredom, without ever fully connecting what I was reading to what it meant about my own position inside it. I understood the deductibles, I understood the copays. I never once thought to ask whose name the policy actually lived under, because I assumed, the way you assume things about people who raised you, that my mother would have told me if it mattered. What I didn't know, because nobody had ever told me and I had never asked, was that I wasn't just an enrolled dependent or an extra body. I was the primary subscriber. When the broker rewrote the policy 6 years ago, he'd needed someone with a clean, verifiable income history and a social security number that would pass underwriting cleanly. And my mother, without asking me, had listed me as the account holder, the person whose employment and eligibility the entire group policy was legally anchored to. My parents and Danielle weren't just enrolled alongside me, they were enrolled under me. I found this out 4 days after that text in the exam room, and only because I called the insurance broker myself, a man named Wallace Yun, who had handled the diner's policy since before I could drive, to ask exactly what my mother had done and what it meant for me going forward. He was surprised I didn't already know. "You're the plan administrator of record," he said. "Have been since 2018. Your mother listed herself and your father and your sister as dependents under your enrollment, because at the time, your income and hours qualified the group for the small business rate. If you're removed as the primary insured, the group doesn't meet minimum enrollment anymore. The whole policy gets flagged for review." "What does flagged for review mean?" I asked, already knowing I wasn't going to like the answer. "It means the underwriter has 30 days to either find a replacement qualifying employee or the group plan lapses entirely. Everyone on it, not just you." I sat with that for a long moment in my car in the clinic parking lot, engine off, hands still on the wheel like I was driving somewhere. My mother hadn't dropped me from a family plan the way you'd cancel a Netflix profile. She had pulled the load-bearing beam out of a structure and told everyone the house would be fine. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. I didn't call Wallace to set a trap. I called him because I needed to know if I still had health insurance, full stop, for myself, as a 32-year-old woman who had just had her blood pressure flagged twice in one visit. That was the entire original purpose of the call. What I learned in the process was simply true. I didn't create the consequence. I just finally understood the mechanism I'd been quietly holding together for 6 years without anyone bothering to explain it to me. I didn't call my mother back that day. I didn't text the group chat, didn't send an angry paragraph, didn't do any of the things a person does when they want to be believed before they're ready to act. I went home, made dinner, and sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open, doing the same thing I imagine a lot of people do when they finally understand they've been quietly financing someone else's comfort for years. I looked at the numbers: 6 years of premium contributions, modest but steady, plus the payroll taxes I'd been paying on wages I never actually earned in exchange for a job I never actually did. 6 years of covering the gap every time the diner's revenue dipped, and my mother asked if I could just cover my portion a little early this month. 6 years of being the invisible qualifying condition for a policy 3 other people used constantly, while I used almost never. And now, apparently my sister needed IVF coverage, which the diner's plan had never covered before, not for anyone, because it wasn't in the policy's original benefit package. My mother hadn't dropped me to save money. She'd dropped me because she'd gone back to Wallace and asked whether removing an enrollee and adding a fertility rider to the plan would keep the premium roughly the same. He'd apparently told her yes, technically, in terms of dollar amount. What he had not told her, because she hadn't asked the right question, was that removing me specifically would break the plan's entire legal foundation, regardless of what she added or subtracted from it. I called Wallace back the next morning and asked him one more question, calmly, the way you ask a question you already suspect the answer to, but want confirmed out loud by someone whose job depends on getting it right. If I formally decline continued enrollment, what happens on your end? Procedurally, I'd have 30 days to notify your mother, as the plan's listed office contact, that the group no longer meets eligibility requirements. She'd need to either replace you with another W-2 employee working the same minimum hours, or the group policy terminates and everyone moves to individual marketplace plans. And if nobody replaces me in 30 days, then it terminates. All 4 of you, or 3 of you, whatever you decide. Coverage ends the same day for everyone on the policy. I asked him not to warn her early, not out of cruelty. I told him the truth, which was that I hadn't decided anything yet, and I wanted 30 days to actually decide instead of being talked out of a decision I hadn't fully made. He said that was fine, that his obligation was procedural notice at time of formal request, not advance warning of someone's private deliberations. I thanked him and hung up, and then I sat there a long time thinking about the difference between what I was allowed to do and what I actually wanted to do, because those 2 things weren't the same yet. For the next several weeks, life at the diner continued exactly as it always had, at least on the surface. I still went to Sunday dinner, still helped clear plates, still sat across from Danielle while she talked through her IVF consultation in the kind of detail that made it clear she'd been waiting all week for someone to ask, even though nobody had. She described the retrieval schedule, the injections she'd need to learn to give herself, the follicle counts the doctor had mentioned like they were already a foregone conclusion instead of a starting point. My mother nodded along at every sentence the way she used to nod along when I talked about physical therapy school, back before the nodding had quietly stopped, somewhere over the years without either of us noticing exactly when. I asked Danielle normal questions, how she was feeling about the injections, whether her husband was planning to be there for the retrieval. I meant them. Whatever else was happening underneath the surface of that month, I never stopped caring whether my sister's body was about to go through something difficult. Those 2 things existed in me at the same time without canceling each other out, which took me longer to understand than I'd like to admit. I didn't say anything about the insurance. I didn't bring up Wallace, or the 30 days, or the fact that I now understood exactly what my mother had done without knowing what she'd done. What I did instead was quietly get my own coverage in order. I called my clinic's HR department and asked what it would take to switch back onto their group plan full-time instead of my token diner coverage. It turned out I'd actually been eligible the entire time and simply hadn't bothered to switch because the diner plan had a lower deductible and I hadn't wanted to rock the boat. Within 2 weeks, I had a new insurance card in my name through my actual job, with actual hours I actually worked. I didn't need the diner's plan anymore. I hadn't needed it in years, if I'm honest. I just never had a reason to leave. I also did something I'm less proud of admitting took me this long to do. I opened my banking app and looked at exactly how much money had moved out of my account over 6 years toward a job I never performed, in exchange for coverage I barely used, so that 3 other people's healthcare could stay affordable while nobody ever once asked if I needed anything back. It came to just under $19,000. Not an enormous sum by the standards of some of the stories I've heard other people tell. But $19,000 is not nothing, and it is especially not nothing when you realize you gave it quietly, structurally, for 6 years and were repaid with a text message telling you that you'd been removed to make room for someone else's turn. I didn't confront anyone with the number. I want to be honest about that too. I wasn't building a case to present at a family meeting with a printed summary and a folder of statements, the way some of these stories go. I wasn't trying to make anyone cry or apologize on command. I was simply done being the quiet answer to a question nobody in my family had ever bothered to ask out loud. On day 28, I called Wallace one final time and told him I was formally declining continued enrollment, effective immediately, and that he was free to notify my mother as the plan's listed contact whenever his procedure required. I didn't call her myself first. I'd had almost a month to do that, and I hadn't, because some part of me understood that if I told her directly, she would find a way to make the conversation about my tone instead of her decision, the way she always had before. I let the paperwork speak for me this time. The call came 4 days later, on a Thursday afternoon, while I was on lunch break in my car outside the clinic. It wasn't my mother. It was the receptionist at the fertility center where Danielle had gone that morning for a scheduled monitoring appointment, the kind of routine check that happens repeatedly throughout an IVF cycle, and where the front desk had just run her insurance and gotten a denial code instead of an authorization. I know this only because my mother called me 11 minutes later, her voice higher than I'd heard it in years. "The insurance won't take her," she said. No hello, no context, like I was already supposed to know what she was talking about. "They're saying the whole policy is inactive. Something about enrollment. I don't understand. What did you do?" "I didn't do anything today," I said. And that was true. I made a decision about a month ago. "You got a formal notice from Wallace. I assume you didn't open it." There was a silence on the line that told me she hadn't. My mother has never been someone who opens paperwork promptly. She has always been someone who assumes things will sort themselves out because they usually have, mostly because I have quietly sorted them. "You canceled our insurance," she said, and her voice had shifted from confused to accusing in the space of one sentence, which is a shift I have watched happen my entire life and somehow still found breathtaking in real time. "I declined my own enrollment," I said. "I wasn't the one who removed a person from a small group plan without understanding what that person's enrollment was actually holding up. That was you. I just stopped being available to fix it quietly. You could have told me." "I did tell you. Wallace sent formal notice almost a week ago. I told him I wanted 30 days before making anything official, and I used every one of them, because for 6 years I have made every single financial decision in this family easy and invisible, and I wanted to know what it felt like to make one decision that was neither." She started to say something about family, about how we take care of each other, about how Danielle needed this, and I let her finish because I've learned that interrupting my mother has never once made her hear anything faster. When she was done, I said the only thing I actually wanted to say. "I spent 6 years being the reason your insurance worked. Nobody in this family ever thanked me for it because nobody in this family ever knew it was happening, because I never made it a thing. The first time I mattered enough to mention out loud was in a text telling me I'd been replaced. So no, I'm not going to feel guilty that the structure you leaned on for 6 years finally needed the person holding it up to still be standing there." I could hear her breathing on the other end, and somewhere behind her, my father's voice asking what was going on, and Danielle, further away, asking if everything was okay with the doctor. My mother didn't answer either of them. She just said my name, once, quietly, the way you say a name when you're realizing you've been standing on something you never looked down at. "Megan," she said. "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "That's the problem. You made a decision that affected 4 people's healthcare without ever finding out how the healthcare actually worked. You just knew I was the extra name on the list, and extra sounded like something you could remove without cost. I want to say that call ended in some kind of resolution, but it didn't. It ended with my mother saying she needed to go handle things at the fertility center, and me saying okay, and both of us hanging up without either of us having actually said we were sorry for anything, because neither of us was fully ready to yet. The days after that were quieter than I expected. My father called once, briefly, mostly to ask logistical questions about how quickly a new group plan could be set up, which told me everything about where his priorities were sitting even in the middle of what should have been an emotional moment. I told him I genuinely didn't know, that he'd need to ask Wallace, and that I was no longer the person managing that particular piece of family infrastructure. He was quiet for a second, then said, in a tone that almost sounded like an apology without using the actual words, that he supposed that made sense. Danielle didn't call for 11 days. When she finally did, it wasn't to apologize, not directly. She asked if I could help her understand her options for individual marketplace coverage, since the diner group plan had officially lapsed and her employer's own insurance had a waiting period she hadn't accounted for. I helped her because I have never once wanted anyone in my family to actually go without health care, only to stop assuming my health care mattered less than theirs by default. There's a difference between those two things, even if it took me 32 years to learn how to hold both at once. My mother and I had one real conversation about it, weeks later, sitting in her kitchen instead of the diner, which felt significant even though neither of us said so out loud. She told me she genuinely believed removing me was a minor administrative change, the kind of thing you do without thinking twice, because in her mind I had always been the safety net, not a person the net depended on. I told her that was exactly the problem, and that I didn't need her to feel destroyed by it. I just needed her to actually understand it, specifically and completely, instead of folding it into a general apology about family stress. Hamamtu admiratur fingling keruo. Whatever it was, you always did. Hami fivin non, I said. That's what I'm asking you to stop believing. Not because I don't love you, because I'm tired of being the invisible reason things worked, and only becoming visible the moment something breaks. She didn't argue with that. I think that was the most honest moment we'd had in years. The two of us sitting at her kitchen table with the afternoon light doing that soft gold thing it does in late fall. Neither of us performing anything for anyone else in the family, just telling the truth about a structure that had quietly depended on me for 6 years without anyone bothering to look underneath it. Danielle eventually found a new fertility clinic that took her employer's insurance once her waiting period ended, a few months later than she'd originally planned, which she was understandably upset about for a while. I didn't apologize for that timeline, because I hadn't caused it. The timeline had been created the moment my mother assumed removing me from a policy was a simple subtraction instead of an act of dismantling something she never understood the architecture of. My parents eventually did set up a new small group plan, with an actual 4th employee this time, a part-time host named Warren, who genuinely works the hours the plan requires, which is either a coincidence or, I suspect, a lesson learned the expensive way. I'm no longer on the diner's payroll in any capacity, fictional or otherwise. My mother asked me once, almost sheepishly, if I minded that they'd found someone else to be the anchor employee. I told her I didn't mind at all. I told her I was glad someone was finally in that role who was actually being paid for actual hours, instead of quietly absorbing the difference the way I had for 6 years, without anyone noticing until they needed me to disappear. I still go to Sunday dinners. Not every week the way I used to, but often enough that nobody's worried I've cut them off entirely, because I haven't. What's different now is smaller than people probably expect from a story like this. There's no dramatic reconciliation scene, no grand apology dinner where everyone cries and admits exactly how wrong they were. What's different is that when my mother makes a decision that touches me now, she asks first. She actually asks out loud before assuming. It's a small thing. It didn't cost her anything to learn except the one afternoon her daughter's insurance policy quietly stopped existing in the middle of an appointment she hadn't planned for. I paid off the last of what I'd quietly been floating for the family over those 6 years, and instead of continuing to fund a structure I was never really part of, I started putting that same amount every month into an account of my own, one with my name on it and no one else's, for the first time in longer than I want to admit. It isn't dramatic. Nobody's life changed overnight because of a canceled insurance policy. But something in my own life got quieter and steadier the moment I stopped being the invisible thing holding someone else's arrangement together. I think about that 30-day window more than I probably should, not with guilt, but with a kind of curiosity about who I was during it. I went to work every day. I answered my mother's calls about ordinary things, the diner's new coffee supplier, whether I wanted to come by for my father's birthday. I never once let on that somewhere underneath all of it, a countdown was running that none of them knew existed. People sometimes ask, when I tell this story, whether I felt powerful during those weeks. I didn't. I felt calm in a way I hadn't been in years, the specific calm that comes from finally understanding a structure you'd spent a long time standing inside without ever being shown the blueprint. I wasn't plotting anything. I was just, for the first time, allowing consequences to happen at their natural speed instead of rushing in to soften them the way I always had before. A few weeks ago, my father asked me, almost offhand, while flipping eggs at the grill, why I hadn't just told my mother what would happen the second she sent that text. I thought about it for a second before I answered, because I wanted to give him the real reason, not the easy one. Because for 6 years, I said, nobody in this family asked me what I needed before deciding what I could give. I wasn't going to spend my one chance to finally matter explaining the consequences in advance. I wanted you all to understand them the same way I did, all at once and without warning. He didn't say anything to that, just nodded slowly and went back to the eggs, which is about as close to acknowledgement as my father tends to get. It was enough. If you've made it this far with me, I want to know something honestly. If you found out you'd been the quiet, invisible foundation holding a family arrangement together for years, and the first time anyone acknowledged your role was the moment they decided to remove you from it, would you have warned them before it collapsed, or let them find out the way I did? Tell me where you land on that, and where you're watching from tonight. There are more stories like this one waiting for you, so if this one meant something to you, stay close because we're just getting started.